May 13, 1943, Tunisia. The Afrika Korps' final stronghold collapsed. German soldiers, once emboldened by desert victories, now stood humble. Among those was Feldwebel Karl Mayr, clutching his rifle with trembling hands. Rommel had fallen. They were prisoners, not just of battle, but of a realization that Germany might never recover its edge. Just days later, Karl boarded a Liberty ship bound across the Atlantic. Even then, staring at the endless ocean, he sensed victory slipping away. But nothing would prepare him for America. These massive freighters, Liberty ships, were marvels of industrial design, over 2,700 built during the war. Each assembled from parts produced across dozens of states. Engines, components, and hull sections converged here, in a feat unseen on continental Europe. 2 weeks into the crossing, American sailors would toss away trays filled with half-eaten steaks, loaves of bread, gallons of milk, carelessly discarded. Karl, who had scrounged every crumb in the North African desert, felt a wave of bewilderment. That such waste existed, not out of malice, but because abundance was taken for granted. It shattered something inside him. June 4, 1943, arrival at Camp Davis, North Carolina. Instead of grim cattle cars, Karl and hundreds of other Afrika Korps soldiers were transported in Pullman coaches, soft padded seats, clean linens, even a hot meal served on board. The local townsfolk, curious and friendly, came out to greet them. But these gestures weren't propaganda. They became the opening chapter in a larger story, one about how exposure to American prosperity could unravel Nazi ideology. Karl's first night, seated under a clear southern sky, he witnessed electricity in ways forbidden in the Reich. Blackouts had cloaked German cities since 1940. Rural farms typically lacked even basic wiring. But here, street lamps burned bright, barns glowed under floodlights, and distant windmills hummed with current generated by rural electrification projects. He'd never seen such brightness. It was as if someone had flipped on the future. Within weeks, he was part of a work detail picking cotton near a Tennessee river. The gin processed bales in minutes. What a German farm village would take weeks to move. The power came from large-scale hydroelectric dams, built just a decade prior. In the pauses between shifts, he watched American farmers operating tractors and combines that dwarfed horse-drawn German equipment. It wasn't just the machinery. Farmhands drove to work in pickups, radios playing news and music crackling through the cab. That morning stretch under an open sky felt like witnessing a world apart from the Reich. In Michigan, another scene echoed this industrial power. At the sprawling River Rouge complex, he helped unload coal. Beyond the fence, factories churned, jeeps, tanks, aircraft engines rolling off assembly lines. The plant consumed more electricity daily than Hamburg, Germany's second largest city. One afternoon, he overheard an American worker joke, "You guys wouldn't believe how many cars I made, but I drove home in my own too." He meant it. The average American factory worker had access to cars, sometimes more than one, while German civilians and officers alike had far less. Back at camp, rumors of re-education programs swirled. But POs didn't need lectures. In their bunkhouses, they traded stories, shared concerns, and listened to broadcasts of jazz music or local news. Libraries stocked banned books. Discussions bubbled up, debates about democracy, ideology, about whether coercion or kindness was stronger. Instead of forced obedience, POs were drawn in by example. By winter 1943, U.S. Army officials noticed something remarkable. Most German POs weren't plotting escape. Only about 0.6% even tried. Escape wasn't worth it, not because of fear, but because what they'd seen made Germany feel like the lesser place, one they might not return to willingly. Instead, they asked for more English language books, newspapers, even university correspondence courses. They were curiosity in motion. This wasn't just war, it was a massive experiment in human transformation. The more they saw, the more old convictions crumbled. Lines blurred, not through propaganda or force, but through everyday reality. Lights, food, machines, free speech, kindness. With every passing day on American soil, the ideology that had dragged them into war began to collapse from within. And so Karl Mayr wrote in his diary that winter, I came expecting chains. Instead, I found conversations. In those words lies the beginning of America's most unexpected campaign that through abundance and dignity, enemies could become admirers. The stage was set. What started in surrender would end in a moral victory, 100 years in the making. June 1943, late 1943, settlement and adaptation. After the landings and initial shock of arrival, Poe's like Feldwebel Karl Mayr found themselves settling into camp life. In places like Camp Concordia, Kansas, clusters of barracks rose beside mess halls, warehouses, even a modest hospital and officers' club, all designed to meet Geneva Convention standards. There, over 1,000 prisoners lived under watchful yet professional supervision. Elsewhere, in remote regions such as the Utah desert, camps like Camp Tuella provided canvas cots and oil stoves to heated barracks. Food, by Geneva guidelines, matched what American soldiers ate. But as rations tightened later in the war, prisoners voiced concerns. Often, POW labor filled local gaps. In places like Vermont and New Hampshire, POWs worked in sawmills and farms, sometimes escaping the barracks to cut pulpwood or haul hay. One German prisoner, Franz Bacher, escaped a camp in rural New Hampshire in August 1944 and vanished into the woods for weeks, highlighting both his determination and the unexpected freedoms found outside wire fences. Even without lecture halls at every camp, the U.S. government pushed re-education in select locations. Fort Eustis, Virginia, hosted a formal program, delivering a 6-day democracy course to around 26,000 German POWs. Topics ranged from the democratic way of life and the Constitution to American family life and why the Weimar Republic failed. This wasn't mere indoctrination, it was a deliberate exposure to democratic values, offered with an open door rather than a gun to the head. At other camps, more informal learning took hold. POW-run newspapers like Der Ruf published works previously banned under the Nazi regime, remarks All Quiet on the Western Front, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, and more. By spring 1945, camp newspapers revealed a dramatic shift. Only 1 in 80 still leaned pro-Nazi. Despite the ideological shifts underway, some POWs still tested boundaries. Less than 1% of all German POWs attempted escape, about half the rate of their Italian counterparts, and many returned more out of boredom than a drive for freedom. The most famous breakout occurred December 23, 1944, at Camp Papago Park near Phoenix. 25 German officers tunneled out, a daring feat termed the Great Papago Escape. Yet within weeks, every single one was recaptured many yards from the Mexican border. While some POWs plotted escape, most slowly integrated into camp life, which wasn't so much violence as adaptation. At Camp Concordia, German prisoners played sports, tended gardens, and even helped staff the camp's fire department, creating community ties across barbed wire lines. In Utah, Camp Tuella offered well-regulated facilities. POWs lived in heated barracks, received proper meals, and enjoyed correspondence privileges, all part of America's effort to show not just strength but values. The sheer normalcy of their daily lives began to erode previous beliefs. Prisoners who arrived convinced of American inferiority soon walked alongside workers on farms, in factories, and on projects that sustained a nation at war. Agricultural shifts occurred in places like New Hampshire and Maine, where POWs powered timber harvesting and harvest labor amid communities that treated them fairly or even kindly. At camps with strong re-education programs, POWs absorbed lessons not from propaganda films, but from conversations and curiosity. Watching shows, reading literature, and turning pages in newspapers became acts of exploration, not indoctrination. And as American society revealed itself in these glimpses, Nazi mythology unraveled one page at a time. By early 1944, the camp world had changed. Official lessons at places like Fort Eustis created awareness. Informal ones, reading banned books, sharing meals under an American sky, listening to radio dramas, offered context. The war raged on overseas, but here in America, a quiet shift unfolded inside POW minds. Even those imprisoned in remote regions no longer thought of escape. They thought of comparatives. How other POWs lived, what they had access to, what they were learning. The 0.6% escape rate wasn't just low, it underscored a transformative inertia, a growing preference to remain where ideals felt more tangible than ideologies. From bewildered desert fighters to curious residents of American camps, these POWs moved through stages: initial confusion, daily work, exposure to ideas, and gradual ideological unraveling. The bars and guards remained, but they shared space now with debates, reading groups, sports fields, and silent recognition that democracy, in its own quiet American way, might be stronger than steel. By mid-1944, the United States hosted over 425,000 German POWs across approximately 700 camps spanning 46 states, mostly located in rural, agricultural, or mild climate areas to minimize security risks and construction costs. These camps resembled U.S. military training sites more than anything ominous: barbed wire, watchtowers, yes, but also barracks, mess halls, hospitals, and recreation buildings built to meet Geneva Convention standards. Take Camp Concordia in Kansas, for instance. By May 1943, 304 structures had risen: a 177-bed hospital, fire station, warehouses, and officers' club, mess halls, and barracks. At its peak, it held over 4,000 German prisoners with a staff of 800 American officers. These camps weren't fortress states, but functional, organized communities. A central feature of camp life involved work programs, guarded, voluntary, and focused on non-military labor. The Geneva Convention permitted POWs to work if paid and in safe conditions across farm fields, mills, canneries, and pulpwood operations. German POWs filled critical labor shortages. In Nebraska, as many as 12,000 POWs helped harvest hay, work in sugar beet fields, and maintain farms. Locals remembered that prisoners who arrived as enemies often left as friends. One farmer's child recalled this with disarming clarity: "They played games with us and brought us candy and gum." Some were skilled masons who even built concrete garages that still stand today. Compensation? POWs earned 80 cents a day, not a windfall, but a token they could spend in the camp canteen. But education, not toil, became the most transformative force. Scholars later dubbed this the barbed wire college, a nod to the efforts to re-educate the prisoners within camp walls. Across dozens of camps, POWs had access to hundreds of democracy, civics, and English language courses. Some even enrolled in accredited college-level classes, recognized by German universities. At camps like Camp White, historian Joe Peterson featured in a compelling lecture details how re-education programs carefully balanced ideological exposure with respect for prisoners' autonomy. In the intellectual heart of this effort lay the Special Projects Division and the POW-run newspaper Der Ruf, The Call. Think of it as an internal think tank. Anti-Nazi intellectuals and literary-minded prisoners drafted articles, curated books, and promoted discussions that would have been forbidden back home. They gathered banned works of Exiliteratur, remarks "All Quiet on the Western Front," Man's the Magic Mountain, Werfel's The Song of Bernadette. Pieces that Nazi censors had long obliterated now graced barbed wire-bound publications. The movement was sweeping. By fall 1945, only 1 in 80 camp newspapers remained even faintly pro-Nazi, down from 75% just months earlier. Beyond literature and labor, POWs experienced the kind of humane, everyday interactions that propaganda couldn't disarm. At some camps, POWs served as fire volunteers, tended gardens, or played pickup soccer with Americans. Not enemies separated by ideology, but individuals drawn together by circumstance and shared routines. Over time, community tensions eased. Locals realized these POWs were often not ideological loyalists, but ordinary men trapped by war. In some towns, German POWs were invited to local events, even dining rooms, a subtle thought, perhaps the seeds of friendship. The confluence of factors, education, humane work, and daily camaraderie, combined to make ideological rigidity unfashionable. Escape attempts, historically rare, fell to just 2,222 total across the U.S., less than 1%. Those who stayed found themselves reconsidering not just where they were, but what they believed. One POW, upon repatriation, reflected that he had become a convinced Democrat not through propaganda or coercion, but because American values were lived in word and deed. From fields in Nebraska to intellectual hubs in camp libraries, German Poes experienced something far more powerful than confinement. They encountered a model of democracy at work. Education met practicality. Exposure trumped ideology. And as they harvested crops, repaired machinery, and debated literature, their worldview quietly shifted. Having seen what America could be, not just in factories or farms, but in its ideals, many Poes left with a new perspective. A perspective that would ripple into post-war Germany, springing not from lectures, but from exposure to dignity, debate, and real example. Stepping from the hush of a POW barracks into a roaring factory floor. This was the real awakening for men like Feldwebel Karlmeyer. Overwhelmed by a power they'd only been told existed, they began to see that the war was being fought not just on battlefields, but in assembly lines, steel mills, and docks across America. Consider the Liberty ships, steel giants born from urgency. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. built 2,710 Liberty ships, the largest class of cargo ships ever produced. At first, launching the SS Patrick Henry took 244 days. But by 1943, shipyards were churning out one every 42 days on average. In an extraordinary feat of speed, the SS Robert E. Perry was launched just 4 days and 15 hours after its keel was laid. These ships weren't merely vessels. They were America's lifelines, carrying troops, food, tanks, and bullets across the seas, faster than the U-boat threats could sink them. If ships spoke of supply, then aircraft spoke of strategic might. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, a single bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes at peak output. Think about that. 60 years earlier, assembly lines had revolutionized car manufacturing. By April 1944, Willow Run was pushing out nearly 500 B-24 Liberators per month, ramping toward a staggering 650 per month. Altogether, across several plants, the U.S. produced about 18,500 B-24 bombers, the most produced U.S. military aircraft ever, with Willis Run alone responsible for over 6,900 of them. These were more than aircraft. They were the physical embodiment of America's ability to far outproduce any enemy. Before even reaching U.S. soil, Poes experienced this industrial onslaught in motion. The SS John W. Brown, a Liberty ship converted into a troop transport, carried 500 Afrika Korps prisoners from Algiers to New York in mid-1943. Even then, the massive scale of logistics, the ability to ferry men and material across oceans with such speed and safety, was deeply disorienting to the prisoners on board. For Poes like Carl, witnessing these factories, ports, and ships was transformative. Imagine watching a B-24 glide off an endless line on a Sunday shift, or setting foot on a shipping terminal where Liberty ships loaded cargo faster than Kriegsmarine U-boats could destroy it. The symbols of Nazi propaganda, irresolve, fragmentation, decay, began to shift into memory. One camp historian, recounting stories from Michigan, said some returning prisoners told friends back home, "We never knew half the United States existed." Some days it felt like the whole world was just factories and lights. These weren't exaggerations. They were descriptions formed by witnessing power in every corner of American life. In Nazi-controlled Europe, factories had been shifting production to frantically support the war. But they never matched the scale, pace, or freedom of American operations. While German factories churned under Allied bombing and resource scarcity, Willow Run in dozens of shipyards kept humming, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Machines, men, and metal synchronized in harmony that few Poes had ever seen. One ex-officer later wrote, "In my barracks I thought our factories were the greatest. In America, I realized I'd been deceived. Their factories buried ours, not just in steel, but in hope." This wasn't achieved through leaflets or speeches. Poes didn't need ideological meetings. They needed to see. They needed to smell the weld motors, to feel the hum of electric lights illuminating entire nights, to taste the smell of ships being painted and hear the roar of bombers being christened for battle. Each minute of production was a minute where belief shifted, fracture grew, and new systems took root in their minds. By late 1944, many Poes expressed intellectual shifts. America wasn't weak. It was strong through collaboration, innovation, and abundance. A prison library card or book became an invitation, proof that civility could be more powerful than tanks. The transformation took root not just in plates of machinery, but in concepts. Democracy, seen through the lens of industrial capitalism, became real. Poes exchanged notes, not just about how many bogies they downed, but about how Willow Run worked 2 shifts, or how Liberty ships sailed while German ports lay bombed and helpless. They carried that back home, even after 1946, when repatriation began. Many became scholars, politicians, and diplomats. One, inspired at Willow Run, studied engineering and helped rebuild German aviation in the 1950s. Stepping out of a U.S. POW camp and back into a devastated Europe wasn't just a journey home, it was a personal crossroads. German soldiers who had once believed in a strong Reich now carried something new, first-hand experience of democracy in action. In this chapter, we explore how that experience reshaped their paths and had ripple effects lasting long beyond the war. By 1946, repatriation was complete. Nearly every German POW held in the U.S., over 425,000 men in about 700 camps, was sent home, many directly reintegrated into labor battalions in Europe before their return to Germany. Forced to rebuild, they came back to a nation fragmented, cities in ruins, resources scarce, and society fractured. In the U.S., many POWs had experienced a society built on abundance and personal dignity. As one scholar put it, their time in the U.S. shaped their post-war perspectives, influencing their attitudes toward democracy and international relations. Among those who returned was a remarkable figure, Walter Hallstein, a Wehrmacht lieutenant captured in June 1944 during the Battle of Cherbourg, then held at Camp Como in Mississippi. Yet Hallstein didn't simply endure captivity, he transformed it. There, he established a camp university teaching law to fellow prisoners and later attended an administrative school focused on U.S. constitutional principles as part of the Sunflower Project, a re-education initiative advocating for democratic governance. After the war, Hallstein rose to become the first president of the European Economic Community Commission 1958 to 1967, a key architect of European integration and the common market. His leadership helped lay the legal and institutional foundations for what would eventually become the European Union. Hallstein's transformation wasn't unique. Across the U.S., the War Department quietly launched the Intellectual Diversion Program in 1944. It was designed to imbue POWs with respect for the quality and potency of American institutions through curated newspapers, books, films, and classroom-style engagements. A cornerstone of this effort was the Special Projects Division, led by Lt. Col. Edward Davison. This group produced Dar Rough the Call, a POW-run newspaper that published banned literature and promoted open debate and democratic thinking. By March 1945, as many as 75% of camp newspapers had pro-Nazi leanings. By that fall, the shift was clear. Only 1 in 80 retained pro-Nazi sentiments. That dramatic turnaround reflected both programmatic effort and lived exposure to a freer society. When POWs returned home, many carried more than memories. They carried ideals. Hallstein's contributions are the most visible example, but countless others influenced local and national spheres in subtler ways. They entered civil service, academia, politics, and business, armed with a new appreciation for institutional transparency, civic engagement, and international collaboration. The war's end didn't close the chapter, it opened a door. Influenced by democratic ideas they encountered in U.S. camps, these returning POWs laid groundwork for the Federal Republic of Germany's rebirth as a stable democracy. In online discussions, descendants echo this transformation in personal terms. One Reddit post shared the story of a POW who stayed on in the U.S., married, and built a new life, highlighting both the human dimension of repatriation and post-war disruption. Meanwhile, while some returning POWs experienced emotional strain or anxiety, studies emphasize that many came back transformed, not just surviving, but changed by what they'd seen in America. By mid-1946, the vast majority of the 425,000 German POWs held across approximately 700 U.S. camps had been repatriated to a devastated Europe. While their return often meant reintegration into reconstruction efforts, including, in some cases, forced labor battalions, many carried with them a powerful inner transformation. One standout example of this shift is Walter Hallstein. Captured in June 1944 during the Battle of Cherbourg, Hallstein spent his captivity at Camp Como, Mississippi. There, he founded a camp university, teaching law and attending courses on U.S. constitutional principles as part of re-education efforts. After the war, Hallstein's path reflects the broader influence of POW experience. He became a key architect of post-war Europe. He helped negotiate the European Coal and Steel Community and later signed the Treaty of Rome, paving the way for the European Economic Community (EC) and Euratom. As the first president of the EC Commission 1958 to 1967, he was often referred to as a kind of European prime minister. His conviction that a federal Europe, inspired by American democratic ideals, was essential for long-term peace and prosperity underscores the depth of his transformation during captivity. Hallstein's influence was remarkable, but he represented a broader diaspora of POWs who returned as agents of change. The intellectual diversion program and publications like Der Ruf had initiated ideological shifts long before their release, through exposure to democratic discourse, literature, and education delivered under humane camp conditions. POWs gradually internalized freedoms Germany had long suppressed. When these men returned home, some entering public service, others academia, business, or civil society, they brought back not just survival, but conviction in democratic ideals. Germany's post-war reconstruction wasn't just physical. It was moral and civic, and partially shaped by these agents of lived experience. The War Department may have seen re-education as a strategic wartime necessity, but its impact was far more profound. Hallstein later credited his time as a POW and his experiences in American institutions as the richest years of his life, ones that reshaped his beliefs about justice, governance, and cooperation. Hundreds of other POWs, though less well-known, made similar choices, opting to rebuild democratic Germany rather than return to old authoritarian structures. Their contributions helped seed a transformed West Germany, rooted not in ideology but in example. There's an ironic wrinkle to this story. In the U.S., German POWs were at times treated better than African American soldiers, exposing hypocrisies in America's own systems even as it modeled freedom to its former enemies. Still, the moral arc that shaped POW transformation persisted, reinforcing that ideology and redemption aren't monopolized by any one nation, but enacted through relationships, dignity, and everyday humanity. Pragmatic beginnings. Camps and re-education started as logistical necessities, but evolved into ideological fields, where democracy proved more contagious than repression. Hallstein is emblematic. From POW teacher to European Commission pioneer, a living example of the transformative power of exposure to democratic principles. Thousands more changed minds. Many former POWs quietly shaped German society, embedding democratic ideals into its post-war DNA. America's soft power in action. Abundance, access, education, and respect became a viral alternative to hatred, a story written not on battlefields, but in barracks and classrooms. As the last German POW marched out of American camps in 1946, he carried with him more than grass-stained clothes. He carried a vision. A democracy that wasn't imposed, but discovered. A nation built not through tanks or force, but through open books, well-lit streets, and civil conversation. America's greatest victory in World War II, perhaps, wasn't measured in bombs or territory, but in the quiet transformation of hearts and minds. The victory that began in darkness ended not just in defeat, but in hope.